Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Age Group Triathlon Podcast. My name is Simon Olney, I'm a professional triathlon coach, and this week we're going to be covering the scientific theory. Now, I'm not here to show you the scientific way to train, I'm here to stop you getting ripped off, I'm here to stop you falling down rabbit holes and believing misinformation. And the way that I'm going to achieve this is by helping you understand exactly what we mean when we talk about something being proven by science, because it's not as simple as you think. The reason for this is that a lot of products are being sold as being scientifically proven. These are quite often nutrition supplements are the worst offenders for this. But it also extends to all sorts of areas of aerodynamics and the like. And when it comes to sports science and the human body, it is far from an exact art. I mean, when I first started coaching, I thought, right, I want everything to be evidence-based. I want everything to be scientific. I'm going to listen to the numbers. But the more I've been coaching, the more I understand about the process, sort of the less faith I have in the system, almost. The main reason being that the vast majority of information out there is manipulated. The quality of the studies may not be very good. There's a huge array of things that can interfere with the messaging that we as athletes and coaches get. And I want to help you just to engage your brain and to understand that just because something's listed as being scientifically proven doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Now, this might be heresy to some of you. Well, it's science, that's how it works. And look, there are, such as the laws of thermodynamics, gravity, there are some things that we can be relatively certain are going to happen, 100% of the time. It's just the way that the world works, and we have taken this and we've made observations and we've now come to an understanding of how something is going to work. But the way the human body responds to a stimulus is far, far, far from being an exact science. Now, to give you an example, at a very high level, before I get into this too much, I'm going to be using the example in this episode of snorting wasps. Okay, it was the most ridiculous thing that I could think of, because I don't want a lawsuit of somebody coming after me saying, you're taking veiled swipes at our supplement product, anything like that, Nobody is going to consider grinding up wasps and snorting them as a powder, as a performance supplement. So if I use this, it hopefully raise a few smiles and prevent me from coming under any kind of scrutiny from manufacturers. And the very high level example I wanted to give is if I take a group of 10 people and I get them all to snort this wasp powder, and 6 of them run faster after snorting the wasp powder, and 4 of them see no effect, or their performance actually decreases, because there is a majority there, because 60% of people saw an improvement, that's science. And I'm sure you can understand when you actually listen to it like that and you think, hang on a minute, that's not science. That's just the results of a sort of a survey. Yeah, it kind of is. And so I'm going to go through this in a bit more detail to help you understand and hopefully just help you be a bit more scientifically literate. Now, I know some of you may go, but Simon, I just want to swim, I just want to cycle, I just want to run. But when you listen to other podcasts, videos on YouTube, all of that, there is going to be an enormous amount of information that is is prescribed to you as being the right way to do it. You have to do this, you need to do this. And there are certain things which are always going to be applicable, like keep your elbow above your wrist in your swim stroke. I think everybody can agree on that. But especially when it comes to areas surrounding nutrition and training, it's an awful lot more nuanced than a lot of people would have you believe. So the first thing that we're going to do in this study is we need to identify a problem. The problem being, we want to improve human performance. That's where a lot of sports studies come from. And it could be that somebody has found something within again, I'm talking absolute nonsense here. Somebody's found something with the genetic makeup of a wasp that they believe something to do with the venom may, I don't know, interact with the nervous system and help provide a better connection to our muscles. There we go. I came up with that on the spot. I'm actually quite happy with that. Yes, wasp venom helps our nervous system interact with our muscles. And what we're going to do is, now that we have identified this this problem, that we want people to run faster, we then create a hypothesis, which is we hypothesize that snorting wasps will increase somebody's triathlon performance. Next up, I need to design some kind of study that will help me understand the effect of this wasp venom on athletes. So I could say, right, well, I'm going to get, I'm going to take, like the example I had before, take 10 athletes. I'm going to get them to do a 5k run, and then they're going to come back the next weekend. They're going to snort this ground up wasp, and they're going to run another 5k, and that will give me an idea of whether this ground up wasp affects somebody's performance. Now, in theory, you think, okay, yeah, that would give us an insight. But hang on a minute, what if one of the participants, or two of the participants, were out on the lash the night before the second run? Well, that's going to have a huge impact on their ability to perform in this test. The fact that we've only got 10 people doing it as well is a little bit suspect. So all of these need to be taken into account. I'll go into detail of different kinds of study, the benefits and the downsides to each of them. But yeah, basically the next stage is to design an experiment, and this is where an awful lot of people go wrong, and this is where we get an awful lot of bad data and bad science coming out of. Now, after I have performed my study and I've collected my data, I then need to interpret that data. I need to go, okay, so what is it that I can learn from this experiment, from the times that people have put out in these 5k time trials? If everybody ran slower, then I have to either discard my hypothesis and have to go, look, it seems that if anything, it actually has a negative impact. I could change the hypothesis if needs be. It could be that I only provide a certain percentage of this ground up wasp. I use a lower dose, as it were. There are all sorts of things that I can go and I can sort of fiddle around with it, play with it, and then do another study afterwards. Or if it comes back and say 8 out of 10 people ran a notably faster 5k time, like, okay, like this is looking really positive. But I would then, ideally look to follow this up. However, that's not always mandatory as such. If I went to university to study sports science, which I did actually consider, shortly after I decided to become a coach, I thought, right, I get a master's in sports science, and I went to university open day and, chatted to people and got a feel for it. But over the years, I've started to realise that, I'm never going to be a sports scientist, and that coaching is actually more about understanding the athlete and knowing how to get the best out of people, more than it is understanding every single little thing going on within the human body. But let's say I was studying at university and I did a study. I wouldn't necessarily have the funds or the ability to do a follow-up study. Again, if I did a small study with a cohort of students from my university, I wouldn't necessarily follow that up with additional testing, but that wouldn't prevent that study from being picked up by certain groups of people, say supplement manufacturers. It wouldn't stop it being picked up by then and as being used as evidence. Because if I did see that 8 out of 10 people saw an improvement in their 5k time. They could splash over their packaging, scientifically proven to improve your 5k time. Now, that seems like a bit of a stretch when you look at the size of the cohort. The fact that they were all the same age, if I'm going to be studying sports science, they're all going to be people in their early 20s, maybe late teens. And we can start to understand that, hang on a minute, there's an awful lot going on here that we need to understand better if we're going to want to band around different statements such as something being scientifically proven. So before we get too much further, I'm going to go through what we call the hierarchy of evidence. And I should point out that I am not a scientist by training. Well, as I've just clearly told people, I'm a coach who is, I guess, more scientifically literate than your average member of the population. But if you're listening to this and you're going, actually, you know what, Simon, that's not how it works, you got it wrong, please do drop me a message, let me know. I would like to be corrected on these things by someone who knows more than I do. But I'm trying to give a very basic level overview. But we're going to look at the hierarchy of evidence, and we can look at different forms of evidence which are which we use when we're trying to discern whether we need to be able to listen to something or someone or not. Now, on right at the bottom, we have something known as non-peer-reviewed media, which is anything that hasn't been kind of run past other scientists in the field. And it includes things such as anecdotes, so stories, it could be that someone told you how they ran the best 5k of their life after a Chinese takeaway, or just sort of tradition, stuff that has actually nothing really in the way of grounding. It could be that this is just stories being reported on the internet, okay? It's a really low level of evidence and something that we really shouldn't be paying a huge amount of attention to if we are putting our scientific hats on. Next up, we have peer-reviewed editorials and expert opinions. Now, before I go much further, I'd like to explain the concept of peer review, what it means, and sort of the problems with the system, really. So the idea behind peer review is that before something gets published in a scientific journal, and a scientific journal is essentially a collection of different studies that have sort of been happening, and that have various scientific journals that cover various different areas such as medicine, natural sciences, all of this. But before someone can submit a paper to a journal, it needs to be peer reviewed, and what happens is it gets sent off to other experts in the field for them to be able to read the paper and to be able to discern whether actually this is worthy of being published. Now, it's very rare, but not unheard of, for a paper when it goes to peer review to be accepted straight off the bat. More often than not, it's just outright rejected, and that's just academia. You may have it come back as with major revisions, so they may go, look, we like what you're doing, and we think it's got legs, but there are a number of problems that you need to address. Or it could come back with minor revisions, where they go, look, this is really good, we really like this, but we feel that you need to tighten this up, or you neglected this. Something in there is going to be causing sort of some concern to the peer reviewers. And the peer reviewers, they are those who volunteer their time to read through these papers, and to be able to give their report on it. And that is one of the big issues with the system, is that it's done completely by volunteers in their own time. There's no money involved in it, and it's it's done for the love of science, which is all very noble, but the fact is that a lot of people just don't have the time to sit down for hours in the evening to go through these papers. And it's a shame, because it pushes out people who have young families and that from being involved with this process. And sort of the outcome is that you can get, the papers always go to the same people who might perhaps not want to stereotype, but be especially kind of cranky, old-fashioned people with too much time on their hands. Don't know, just putting that out of the air there. Not always, but it can be the case. Who kind of, they get a little bit of a power kick out of it. And let's be honest, if somebody gets a paper for peer review, or one of the authors on the paper, somebody involved with the study, is someone who they have butted heads with before professionally, hopefully not personally, but yeah, if there's someone who maybe have a little bit of a grudge against, because academia is very very competitive. In fact, getting the money to be able to run these studies is an extreme sport in itself. It's very difficult to get funding, and if people are all scrapping over the same bits of funding, it's not uncommon for feuds to appear, and it's difficult for that bias not to appear within the feedback that somebody gives. So if we're looking at peer-reviewed editorials and expert opinions, a peer-reviewed editorial, it's an opinion piece that is published in a journal, and it's openly advertised as being an opinion piece. It might be based on scientific evidence, but at the end of the day, it is still just an opinion piece. And it's generally somebody who has some like a history of working in that field, who is giving their experience or their opinion on how things on details within their field. And it can be interesting, it can be useful, they can summarize things and how it's applied very easily, but it is still opinion. And as a result, it doesn't come up nearly as highly in the hierarchy as other forms of evidence, which are going to be based on more reliable forms of information. Next up, we have observational research, and this is research that is conducted outside of a clinical setting. So it could be that that researchers, for instance, they go into a school and they find a group of 16-year-olds that are just about to leave school, and they take a variety of metrics on these school children, such as their could be their income, their weight. It could be all of these that they could have a look at, and they could look back at the data. They could follow up 10 years later and see how people's health is all these years later. And this is how we get data that suggests things such as those who are on low incomes are 15% more likely to develop heart disease than somebody who is on the median wage. Or it could be that they are simply looking for the long-term correlation between somebody's body weight and their likelihood of developing heart disease. But we're not sitting down in a lab. It's not a clinical setting. It is simply collecting data over what's normally a relatively prolonged period. And it gives us a snapshot. It gives us an idea of how things, of how long-term behaviours appear. Because at the end of the day, as great as it is to have a controlled experiment in a lab, where you can have somebody with all sorts of, with a mask on and all sorts of sensors on their body measuring their performance, actually getting data from the field, from real life, is actually often more useful than if you were simply if you were just doing lab test after lab test, because how people perform on the running track, how people perform when they're rowing, all of that is actually what it is that we're looking to try and improve, which is their performance in the field. Next up, we have a randomised control trial, otherwise known as an RCT, which unfortunately does not stand for Roller Coaster Tycoon. If you're of a certain age, you might get that. So a randomised control trial, you take a group of eligible test subjects. So if you get a group of 50 adults who are all runners, and you say, look, we are going to split you up into different groups. So they will randomise 25 in one group, 25 in another. And nobody knows which group it is that they're in. So they would then, for the purpose of our ridiculous experiment, one half of the group would get the ground up wasp to snort, the other would be given something that is completely harmless, such as, I don't know, flour, sugar, something like that. And they would then go out and you would have a trial that tested how their performances were before and after taking this supplement. And you would then be able to it would then be able to give us a clear idea, because if those who took the placebo, so those who took on the harmless substance, saw zero change in their performance, but everybody who snorted the wasp venom ended up having a 5% improvement in their 5k time as a result, then you can go, hang on a minute, there's definitely something here. It's definitely this is definitely of interest. Whereas if everybody had exactly the same results between them, then you go, okay, like there's clearly nothing to this, because the placebo is having the same effect as this sort of potential supplement that we're creating. So this this randomized control trial, again, one of the downsides of these is that you can't really control what it is that people are doing outside. So if somebody's taking a supplement for 6 weeks before the retest, you're generally not in control of what the test subject does in those weeks between. So you're definitely not under the same amount of control that you'd like to be. But let's face it, these people have to go out and live their lives. And this is one of the downsides to any scientific study, which is, unless you're having people living and training under observation over the entire duration of the study, you're never going to get really clean data. And finally, at the very top of our hierarchy of evidence, we have systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized control trials. Now that's a real mouthful, but essentially what they do is they look at all the studies on the subject, and they then draw a conclusion based on the results of these. So let's say that this ground up wasp venom had been a bit of a hit. A lot of people got very excited by it. And as a matter of fact, 12 different people ran studies on this. They've gone, okay, that's really exciting. That's really interesting. Now let's sit down and let's go through all of those studies and see what we can find. Because if I did a study on this and I found that there was a 5% benefit in somebody's 5k time after they've taken this supplement, but nobody else saw any change, any difference, then at the end of the day, the weight of evidence is going to be, well, unfortunately, despite what you think you saw, then it must have been something else that was affecting that, or we don't believe that is the case. It could be that my study was poorly designed. It could be that I'd used very new runners who you would expect to improve their performance over that time anyway. It could be that I held the first test outside in the absolute pouring rain on a really chilly day, and then the next day was perfect. The next time I did it was perfect running conditions. There's all sorts of factors which can affect this, and I hope you're starting to understand, if you didn't know this already, just how kind of almost unscientific sports science is. Now, let's be honest, the reality is that anybody who is serious about performing a proper study would perform it on a treadmill in a controlled environment rather than having people run around a running track, because there are just too many variables there. But what the media and certain manufacturers are very good at is cottoning onto one study. And if, let's say, the Daily Mail, because I apologise if this is your choice of newspaper, but they are quite well known for doing this. They could find my study, and they could take my study in isolation and print it on their front page, saying, "Snort wasp venom and improve your endurance sport." The fact that there were 11 studies which showed no difference doesn't mean anything to them, okay? They want headlines, they want sensationalism, they want people to buy their paper or buy a subscription to their online paper to try and understand what it is that's sort of going on, how it is that they can sort of leverage the benefits of this. So you do need to be really careful with what it is that you read. You know, there are all sorts of newspapers that talk about, you know, doctors say that you should drink, you know, a glass of wine. Well, which doctors? Harold Shipman? You know, it's very easy for people to be drawn in by this and want to believe it because it's science, because it is what they deem to be a reputable publication that is telling this. And more often than not, they want to believe these things. If somebody sees a headline saying that you should have a glass of red wine every night to protect against heart disease, they want to believe that because they want to be able to break out a bottle of red every night and to be able to have a glass and think, you know what I'm doing with this? I'm extending my life. The fact that alcohol is generally, you know, it's understood to be a carcinogenic, so it will cause cancer. And it's high in calories and all the other problems that come with alcohol, it doesn't really matter to them because they saw something on the internet that told them it was good for them. So you do have to be really careful, and I hope this podcast, if nothing else, is going to help you just think a bit more critically when you see these claims. Now I am going to bounce back to study design, and this is where so many sports science studies fall down. And this is, I mean, sometimes through absolutely no fault of the researcher themselves, if somebody is looking to test something quite obscure, such as biathlon performance, you know, again, it could be it's really popular where you are, but I think that as far as kind of Olympic sports go, it's about as kind of as unpopular as it gets. Maybe something like shot put, actually, you know, where you have, you know, people who are incredibly good at it, but if you were to go down to your athletics club, the chance of there being a world-class shot putter are relatively low, but chance of there being really good runners are much higher. The low participant numbers can be a real limiting factor, but there are also times where researchers just don't help themselves. So, using a classic example is, you know, a study that was conducted by somebody on a sports science course. All of the people that they work with are going to be of the same age, broadly speaking, probably early 20s. And on top of that, there is a good chance that all of the participants are going to be male, because sports science is a very male-dominated field. Now, if there is a study that looks at the benefits of this ground-up wasp on 21-year-old males, and there is, you know, you can really see there is something very definite there, does that mean that as a menopausal woman, that you are going to see the same results? You know, there's quite a different population group, somebody at a very different time in their life, whose body is working quite differently in some respects, may not respond to it in the same way. And especially if there is quite a thin margin, so if we did a study and we found that 60% of these 20-year-old males saw a benefit, that also means that there's 40% who didn't see any benefit, who were non-responders. So we really do have to keep all this in mind. And if you want to see exactly sort of the study design and how it works, you do need to actually read the paper itself. And unfortunately, not many of us have the time, the headspace, the energy to do these things. We trust experts to be able to interpret these studies for us. Now, you know, but sometimes it still shocks me to this day. Some people consider me an expert in the triathlon space. However, I'm not an expert in the sort of the realm of science. So I spend time working with athletes. I don't spend time poring over scientific journals. You know, I do rely somewhat on those who are more scientifically literate than me to be able to look through all of these and sort of understand for me. Now this leaves us open to two things really: prejudice and corruption. Like I mentioned earlier, if a peer reviewing team didn't see eye to eye with the author of a paper, that can affect that. The prejudice from the individual who is processing the data for me. That can be based on sort of their own experience. If somebody tried creatine and their body reacted really negatively to it, they're probably going to take that bias in some kind of to a greater or lesser extent into any kind of reporting that they do on these meta-analyses. Now, on the subject of corruption, something that's really important is understanding where the money came from for that study. The old saying, follow the money, it does have some legs. So, where is the money coming for this? Well, we can have a look and we can understand that, if we find a study that looks at the impact of soft drinks on children, if we then find out that study was funded by a manufacturer of soft drinks, regardless of the conclusion that they make and the scientific theory they come out with at the end, unfortunately, we can't really take that at face value. I mean, it is possible that this soft drink manufacturer genuinely wanted to understand the impact that their soft drinks were having on the health of the children that drink them, so they could maybe change their messaging or their ingredients. They could make some kind of adjustment. But it's more likely that the soft drinks manufacturer said, look, to an unscrupulous researcher, look, we're going to give you all this money for a study as long as you make sure that you come to this conclusion. And I know that might sound really cynical of me to say that. And a lot of you may go, Simon, there's no way that happens. I mean, it's the kind of thing, it's very difficult to prove that it does happen. But from people that I've spoken to who know a lot more about these things than I do, the message is, yeah, that 100% happens. Like, maybe not often, but it's been known to happen. I'm sure this has thrown a lot of you into sort of a sense of sort of confusion and doubt. And you go, well, hang on a minute, what can I actually believe? I thought science was science. And you know what? I get it. I hear you. It is, it is sort of slightly depressing to understand that, a lot of what you're told isn't necessarily true. And that, the system is quite prone to corruption and the like. But there are, sort of good places to go outside of scientific journals for good quality sources of information. Sort of recently published academic textbooks are one of them. And when I say recently published, I mean ideally within the last 5 years, depending on the field. Sports science, especially so, because things tend to change really quite fast. And sort of textbooks that were written sort of 10, definitely 15, 20 years ago, I wouldn't touch with a barge pole, personally. Things would have changed so much. There would have been so many studies that could have proven or disproven what it is that you've read, that you really do need to keep on top of this. Anything related to sort of from public bodies when it comes to sports science. So, I mean, sports science and public bodies don't generally go together that well. Something like the World Anti-Doping Association, perhaps, might be, or governing bodies. It's even certain, I mean, it might be that different healthcare providers, such as the NHS, it may be they have something in there that is you can have a look at. Although I know people who are experts in their field at a very high level that go, oh, well, you can't listen to everything you read on the NHS website. It really does, everything that you thought that you knew was true and reliable, turns out it's not. Anything, again, any international bodies as well. Generally speaking, any kind of conference presentations by sort of respected researchers. Again, it's not peer reviewed, but the evidence that they're using will have been peer reviewed in itself. And yeah, that broadly speaking, you should be able to trust what it is that they say. Areas that you definitely can't trust as sources for scientific information are sort of social media. If anybody is providing anything without any kind of source or information to support their claims, that should be a massive red flag. I think YouTube is especially bad for sharing misinformation. But that's shared on other platforms, again, you do need to be really aware of. I would be just really mindful, really careful of these, because it's very easy to fall into this kind of rabbit hole of misinformation, and you find out that none of it has got any real scientific backing to it whatsoever. Quick caveat here is that not everything does need to be peer reviewed. If, for instance, somebody goes for a sports massage, and their legs feel a lot better the next day, they don't need science to tell them that their legs feel better. You are never going to find any scientific study that's done on sports massage due to the nature of it. It's so difficult to prove that a sports massage has helped someone. And you don't. It's not the kind of thing that you really need to prove with science anyway. But yet you will get people lining up saying, actually, there's no scientific evidence that sports massage has any difference on sporting performance, and that's not because people have done studies and they have found that there have been zero changes to someone's performance after they've had a sports massage. It is simply that they haven't done any studies on it. It's not something that really needs to be studied, and it does annoy me when you get people who do think that peer review is the absolute be all and end all, and if anything that's not peer reviewed they can just discard. Somebody shares something, oh, what's your source for that? Oh, well, it's not peer reviewed. And look, I get it. If it is some groundbreaking science, if it is something that is that we all need to sort of take quite seriously and think carefully about, yes, obviously it being peer reviewed is important, but there are certain things that you just don't need a study or peer review to prove. Something else to consider is whether the information that you're getting is coming from an individual or whether it's coming from an organisation, and the difference may not be as impactful as big as you think. You can't just trust anything that comes out of an organisation's social media channels. However, the chances of, especially big reputable, especially any sort of universities, any large organisation, intentionally pushing out any misinformation is quite low, because they will be called out and they will be dragged for that. Whereas anyone can set up a camera in their parents' spare room where they're living and record a 3-hour rant about how big food is causing everybody to be fat, you need to do this, and the government and conspiracy theories and all this misinformation. So as a very general rule, you should be mindful of that. And again, on the subject of conspiracy theories, there is a friend of mine. I use friend in the loosest term. I did a job with her in the film industry about 15 years ago, and she is always posting these conspiracy theories on her Facebook. And any time that anyone comes to challenge her, she posts, it goes, oh, watch this YouTube, this 3-hour YouTube video, and you'll understand everything. Look, if somebody is an efficient communicator, if someone is able to express their ideas in a coherent fashion, you shouldn't need 3 hours of your time to explain that. The reason the video is 3 hours long is to get more ad revenue from that, and they get to make more money out of gullible people. And the same is true with science. If you can't explain the subject in a clear, concise way, then you probably don't really understand it. Now, sports science is generally much less about what's right and wrong, and it's much more about shades of grey, because we all respond to different things in different ways. You'll have some people who can get round an entire Ironman just using energy drinks and energy gels, and other people who need to eat real food the whole way round because their digestive system just doesn't agree with sugar. Does that make the person who is eating real food wrong? Well, no, especially if they're putting in a faster time than the person who relied on gels, because the person who relied on gels has to stop at every portaloo because it's coming out both ends. Just because the evidence suggests that something is sort of the way you should be thinking of doing it, doesn't mean that's the way that you have to do it. These studies that are done on, say, Ironman athletes, they'll be looking at those at the pointier end of things, people who'll be finishing the event in around about 8 hours, 9 hours. That's where they'll be looking at that. That data coming from, and go, oh yes, sugar is clearly the superior energy source. And yes, if you are racing at a higher intensity for a shorter period of time, yes, sugar is obviously the right way to go about that. But if you woke up and if you're looking at sort of a 17-hour Ironman, if you spent 17 hours on a Sunday where you're not racing, you're just potting around the house, living off nothing but sugar and energy drinks, how unwell do you think you'd feel by the end of that day? And you have to, okay, right, well, I guess somebody who's doing, a longer Ironman is going to have to change their approach relative to someone who is following what the science tells them to do. So, I'm sure that if you've got this far through the podcast, you've definitely stopped thinking of science being the absolute be-all and end-all, and that you'd be thinking a bit more about, okay, well, what if I'm a non-responder? What if people of my sort of gender, age, ethnicity, disability weren't included in those studies? Are they still relevant to me? And, what percentage of people in the study did see an improvement? How large was the improvement? These are all things that we have to consider. And the reason I'm talking through all this is because companies love to stick scientifically proven or backed by science on their products. And sometimes this really genuinely is the case. There are a number of companies out there, sports nutrition companies, that pay for a huge amount of research into sort of the field of sports nutrition, and they use the results of those studies to inform what it is that they are going to manufacture. Okay, and that really is backed by science. But you have a lot of people who are flogging what is essentially the about as useful as a ground up wasp that you need to snort, to, I wouldn't say sort of quite gullible people, but people who don't think these things do quite as much, people who don't do any further reading, people who just see something being scientifically proven. They get pulled aside at a trade show by someone who goes, oh, have you heard about our product? It will reduce cramps by 60%. And instead of someone going, okay, well, what's the active ingredient? What studies, what were the studies that proved that? You get most people just go, oh, wow. And before they know it, bang, that salesperson's made a sale because they have perhaps misinterpreted, maybe deliberately misrepresented the data from these studies to suit their own profit margins. And this is especially rife in triathlon, where not only do you have a lot of people with a decent amount of disposable income, you also have a lot of people who are looking for quick fixes, for reasons, ways that they can get ahead of their competition. So, bit of an unusual episode there. I hope you found it interesting. I guess the main thing I want you to take away from this is not to fall head over heels for anything that is described as being scientifically proven. That's normally a bit of a red flag. Not to buy anything without doing a little bit more research. And above all, sort of maybe question if you have a detailed, an expensive supplement routine where you're spending a lot of money each month on supplements. Maybe do a bit of reading on this and find out if they're actually doing anything for you. I really hope you found this useful. Bit of a different episode. I'm sorry if it wasn't as interesting as the normal episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast, wherever it is that you get your podcast, to make sure you stay up to date. If you've got any questions or you'd like to have a chat about coaching, my email is down in the show notes. And I really hope that you have a fantastic week of training. I'll see you all next Tuesday morning.